Oak Bay, Gordon Head.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I rise to speak in favour and support of Bill 34, Greenhouse Gas Reduction Targets, Amendment Act 2018. Honourable Speaker, this Act is putting forward a number of amendments to the original Greenhouse Gas Reduction Targets Act, which was assented on November the 29th, 2007. That Act has three parts to it, one with respect to future greenhouse gas emission targets, one with respect to carbon-neutral public sector, and one that had some general provisions. It is the first part that the amendments are being put forward today under three main areas. The first, of course, is new targets are being added for 2030 and for 2040. The government is proposing a 40% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 relative to 2000 levels, and a 60% reduction relative to 2000 levels by 2040. In addition, Honourable Speaker, we know that there's sections being added here to give the Minister executive power through Lieutenant Governor's Order in Council to provide sectoral reduction targets as we move forward. And in addition, and in direct response to the Auditor General's report, Federal Auditor General's report, the government is proposing to have starting in 2020 and reporting every 2 years after that, a report will be introduced that will discuss both the determination of the risks to BC with respect to that could be expected from changing climate, the progress has been made towards addressing those risks, the actions that have been taken to achieve that progress, and the plans to continue that progress. Honourable Speaker, I'd like to go back to the original Act in 2007 that's being amended to me, because that was a very important time in my life, Honourable Speaker. 2007 was the year in which the IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its fourth assessment report on climate change, and in that year they also received the Nobel Peace Prize. I remember that year very, very well, and I remember that year because of the fact that the BC government at the time, under the leader Gordon Campbell, decided that this was an opportunity that BC could not afford to miss out on, because Gordon Campbell, the Premier at the time, recognized, as did his Environment Minister Barry Penner, that climate change, having a climate change greenhouse gas reduction strategy, is essential to saying having a vision. It's essentially exactly the same as saying having a vision for a renewable, clean 21st century economy that brings prosperity not only for the present generation, but also for future generations thereafter. He recognized that the very first piece of legislation that needs to be introduced prior to bringing in steps to actually mitigate greenhouse gases was setting a goal. And that goal in 2007, in the Act that received royal assent on November the 27th, was greenhouse gas reduction targets. I sat in the audience proudly watching that day when the bill was read here. As I see young children from a school here, I sat where they sat that day and listened to the minister at the time, Barry Penner, bring in this legislation. I felt proud to be British Columbian. I told my colleagues around the world that look at the jurisdiction we had, and I'll come to that in a second, because it was not just about the goal, the target that was put in. It was the subsequent legislation that was brought through in a diversity of arrays. But in 2007, something happened. Mr. Campbell, the Premier, recognized that what we need to do is we need to send a signal to the market in British Columbia that we are going to be leaders in the new economy. We see the emergence of a clean tech sector, we see the emergence of renewable energy sector, and we see the emergence of investments by companies in reducing greenhouse gases. A lot of that was done by the subsequent measures that were brought in place. Also, I talked about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Targets Act. That was a goal that subsequently was buttressed by a number of measures brought in through, for example, the Carbon Tax Act, which was assented to on May the 29th, 2008. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Cap and Trade Act, which was assented to on May the 29th, 2008. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Emission Standards Statutes Amendment Act, which was assented to on May the 29th, 2008. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Renewable Low Carbon Fuel Requirements Act, That was assented to on May the 1st, 2008. The Utilities Commission Amendment Act, that was assented to on May the 1st, 2008. The Local Government Green Community Statutes Amendment Act, which received royal assent on May the 29th. We have the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Emission Standards Statutes Amendment Act, which I already made. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Vehicle Emission Standards Act, another act assented to on May the 29th. And then we had the Utilities Commission Amendment Act. And finally, we had the Clean Energy Act, brought in on June the 3rd, 2010. During that time, as British Columbia was leading up to the Winter Olympics, a very strong signal was being sent to the market. I remember, as part of the climate action team, the very first climate action team, the multitude of meetings that we had as we made recommendations to government about the type of policy measures they might consider. We were tasked primarily with coming up with interim targets for 2012 and 2016. We came up with targets that in 2012 we were putting forward that we believe that government should seek to reduce emissions by 6% relative to 2007 by 2012. And by 2016, the second target that we were tasked with providing recommendations for, we came up with 18% by 2016. Government was on track, in fact, made its 2012 target based on the policy measures that were put in place. And we knew, and government knew at that time, through a wedge analysis, that we were not going to make the 2020 target of 33% reductions by 2020 with the policy measures and those bills and statutes on the table, and more needed to be done. Despite what the member from Kamloops North Thompson suggests, there was no plan for 2040. The fake numbers brought up about somehow this was part of the government's plan. I recognize that he wasn't there, and he'd probably throw his hands up to say, what do I know, I wasn't there. However, the reality is I was there, Honourable Speaker. I was there working on the climate action team. I was meeting with the Premier at the time, Gordon Campbell, and the Minister of Environment numerous times during that time in an advisory capacity. And as I say again, I was proud to be British Columbian because Mr. Campbell recognized the economic opportunity associated with dealing with greenhouse gases, associated with being clean instead of polluting. All of this came to an end, Honourable Speaker. All of this came to an end with a switch in leadership. And the first crack in the wall, or hole in the dike, started in July of 2012, when LNG was excluded in the Clean Energy Act, so that energy would have to be renewable unless it was being used in the compression of liquefied natural gas. That was the first act. But it became far more aggressive towards dismantling the policies, and that culminated in 2014 in the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act, wherein we in this legislature repealed the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Cap and Trade Act that was assented to on May the 29th, 2008. We repealed that act, an act that business had actually sought, and even today, in speaking with heavy point source emitters, they wish that we had that legislation in place. Why, of course, is that we try to meet our targets. We have to recognize is that in our society, there's a diversity of emitters. There's large point source emitters, like cement manufacturers. There's like Rio Tinto Alcan, like pulp mills or paper mills. These large point source emitters are subject to the carbon tax. But the original intention back in the day, back in 2007, 2008, was that a regulatory framework was put in place, that enabling framework was there through the cap and trade legislation, that would allow for the inclusion of large point source heavy emitters while exempting them from the carbon tax. So they're still covered by emissions pricing, but it's an internal emission pricing within heavy industry that allows the most efficient investment of money to reduce emissions. This is the approach California has done with large heavy emitters. This is the approach Quebec has done. This is not the approach of some other province, but in certain states, but many jurisdictions around the world have cap and trade legislation or enabling legislation. Some more aggressively so than others. So with the repeal of that legislation, large point source emitters were left wondering what to do. They were left troubled by the fact that they're now going to be incorporated into emissions pricing, a straight-up pricing. and that really what we care about is internally reducing our emissions in British Columbia, and by spending money in the most efficient and effective ways of doing that. And the Rio Tintos of this world that have spent billions of dollars of upgrading their facility, to reduce emissions by 50% at the same time, would potentially be in trouble if it's suddenly only a carbon tax approach as opposed to a cap and trade approach, which have given them a recognition for early adoption of measures that were subsequently brought in. That would be allowed and possible within the cap and trade system. So I still hope government one day will be bringing in that legislation. Don't have to go far, Honourable Speaker. Don't have to go far to find out where it is, because it's right there in the legislation that we repealed in 2014 in the Greenhouse Gas Industrial Reporting and Control Act, which, as a little sidebar, you'll recall that I proposed an amendment which didn't pass to rename it the Greenhouse Gas Increase and Industrial Reporting Act back in the day. Coming back to the issue of emissions, we now know in British Columbia that we have 2 new targets set in this bill: 40% by 2030 relative to 2007, and 60% at 2040 relative to 2007, and the existing and old target of 80% by 2050. Now, why that 80% number is critical, is that while some might cynically say that, okay, it means we don't have to do anything and other governments are responsible, that number sends a signal to market, a very strong signal to market that government should listen to. And that signal is this: we can no longer spend any more money investing in fossil fuel intensive infrastructure in the province of British Columbia today, because we know that we're not going to tear it down tomorrow. Instead, we should be transitioning away fossil fuel to renewables and a low carbon economy. We don't build a coal-fired electricity plant to tear it down tomorrow. We don't build an LNG facility, a 2-train or 4-train LNG facility in Kitimat, to tear it down tomorrow. We build them to last 40, 50 years. We build them to last until 2050. And therein lies the conundrum the government has if it's trying to talk on the one hand about LNG and on the other about meeting climate targets. The previous government lost all credibility on that file as they were talking 23 permits and 5 big plants, but I mean, it was just outrageous, the rhetoric that was coming from the opposition then government about the wealth and prosperity for one and all from LNG that clearly didn't transpire. I recognize that the present government has taken the giveaway one step further with reduced electricity rates, exemption of increase in carbon tax, and as also talk about repealing the LNG income tax, which I hope my colleagues opposite will not support the repeal of, as we will not support here on the BC Greens. But coming back to that, in 2007, Honourable Speaker, that's the reference point. That is the reference point upon which all future reductions are measured against. We in British Columbia emitted 64.7 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, the carbon dioxide equivalent means that we know that methane on a longer time scale, on a 100-year time scale, is much more powerful, as is nitrous oxide or certain CFCs or HCFCs. They're more powerful on a molecule-to-molecule basis in terms of their absorptive ability on greenhouse gases. And so we convert them, all those other greenhouse gas emissions, to the carbon dioxide equivalent. So we had 64.7 megatons. In 2008, we had 64.7 megatons of emissions again. In 2009, not because of any grandiose immediate policy, although we recognize that there was a very strong signal at the time sent to the market that carbon price was going up, and there was investment at the time, emissions dropped to 61.1 megatons. But part of that, too, was because of an economic downturn that didn't really hurt BC, but hurt global economies. 2010, we were down to 60.6 megatons. 2011, we were down to 61.1 megatons. 2012, and here's where the policy shift started to happen. 2012, 61.9 megatons. 2013, 62.9 megatons. 2014, 62.3 megatons. And 2015, 63.3 megatons. Every single year since the change of leadership in this government, of the previous government, emissions went up. And why did they go up? because government sent exactly the wrong signal to market that you want to send if you want to head towards decreasing emissions. Government introduced exemptions on the deep well royalty credit, not only for deep wells, but now for shallow wells, heck, for any well. Royalty credits now exist. Did you know, Honourable Speaker, 10 years ago, we used to get $35 or so for every 1,000 cubic meters of natural gas produced in the province of British Columbia as a royalty, $35, and now it's less than $3. Less than $3 as a royalty. It was more than 10 times just a decade ago. It's going down and still. And at the same time, the production of natural gas has gone up and up and up. Why wouldn't you take it out if we're giving it away? Literally, we give this resource away, this beautiful resource, that for applications that we have no idea in the future. We know that these molecules are very useful in the petrochemical industry. We know they're very useful in other industries of creating fertilizer and creating methanol. We know that we can use our natural gas resources in a diversity of ways. Burning it is one of the most ridiculous ways, and frankly, generations from us after are going to look to our generation and say, why did you squander that resource? Why did you burn it when the most powerful source of energy, the sun, is free, and as is geothermal energy? So let's come back to the targets, because it's critical that we do that. So I pointed out that in 2015 now we're at 63.3 megatons. That's the last reporting year, and for the next little bit I'll assume that we haven't changed from that. Not because that's correct or wrong, but because that is the last year we have reporting data officially done to Canada, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. 63.3 megatons of CO2 equivalent from BC in 2015. So we know, let's suppose we know that we're going to add 4-train LNG facility. Shell Canada talks about a 2-train facility right now, but you don't build 2-train not to build 4-train. So let's suppose we talk about a 4-train facility, that's really the direction we're heading. Well, we know, as I've mentioned already, that if we start at 64.7 megatons, that's the 2007 reference value that this legislation is referring to. We know that our 2030 target of a 40% reduction of that 64.7 megatons means we have to go down to 38.8 megatons by 2030, to 25.88 megatons by 2040, and to 12.9 megatons by 2050. So that's 64.7 megatons in 2007, under the legislation before us, must drop to 38.8 in 2030, 25.88 or 25.9 in 2040, and 12.9 in 2050. Now, if we're going to add a 4-train LNG facility, we're going to add 8.6 megatons. And that's before some of the recent estimates that will be, I could talk about shortly, about fugitive emissions. 28.6 megaton adding on to that. So our new reference case is actually, well, we're basically adding 8.6 megatons to that 2015 value. 2015 value was 63.3 megatons. We're going to add 8.6. We're going to come up to 72.9 megatons. 72.9 is our starting point because we're adding 8.6 for reductions. So let's suppose that we know we're going to put in a 4-train LNG facility. We know, Honourable Speaker, Shell won't build that today to tear it down tomorrow. It's going to last for several decades. They're not going to invest billions of dollars just on a whim. It'll last decades. So what does this mean to greenhouse gas reductions in every other sector? So here's the numbers, Honourable Speaker. We know that we know that if we have a 4-train LNG facility, that's going to be constant, it's going to be there, not going to tear it down, then every other sector in our economy, other than that facility, must drop its emissions by 52% by 2030, down to 30.2 megatons, by 73% by 2040, and by a whopping 95% by 2050. Now, reflect upon this, Honourable Speaker. One 4-train LNG facility in Kitimat will produce 8.6 megatons of emissions that aren't going to be around just for tomorrow and then we tear it down. That'll be around for decades. If we add those 4 trains and we believe these targets that we've actually put forward, then we need every other sector of our economy to reduce its emissions by 95%. That means telling Rio Tinto, Alcan, I'm sorry, but you have to shut down. That means saying nobody can drive fossil fuel combusted vehicles anymore, nowhere in BC. That means telling heavy industry left, right, and center they have to shut down, because we're already at that with things like landfills, which we have to close down as well. So there's a staggering disconnect. And to be fair to the politicians in this room, it's not just here, it's globally. There's a staggering disconnect between science and policy here in BC, in Canada, and internationally. I'll come back to that again in a couple of seconds. Leaders around the world signed in 2017 something called the Paris Accord, which committed, Honourable Speaker, Canada being one of the signatories of it, and despite the fact that Trump wants to get out of it, he can't tell for years to come, committed to keep global warming to below 2 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels, and they would actually keep it substantially below 2 degrees. So what can science say, Honourable Speaker? It can say this. We know the world has warmed 1.1 degrees already. We know that 2016 was the hottest year on record, followed by 2015, 2017, 2014, 2010, 2013, 2005, 2009. For those people who've been following this climate change debate, like I have for so many years, you should be asking the question, where were all those skeptics who said we're in a cooling period? What happened to them? Oh, they're finding some other argument now, because we, believe it or not, scientific communities understood thermometers quite well for several centuries, and in fact the world is warming and we can measure it. 40% of Republicans in the US don't believe there's solid evidence that the world's warming. Frankly, they don't believe in the existence of thermometers. That's the scale of that. We know the world's warmed by 1.1 degrees. We know if we do no more, we do nothing but keep existing greenhouse gas levels fixed at the present day values, we're going to warm by another 0.6 degrees. That takes us to 1.7 degrees, Honourable Speaker, and we know that the permafrost carbon feedback is going to give us another 0.2 to 0.3. We know, Honourable Speaker, that if we do no more than just keep the levels like they are now, we're going to warm towards 1.8 or 1.9. Yet emissions continue to go up year after year in places like Canada and elsewhere. So the disconnect that I mentioned about here in British Columbia extends globally. It's particularly in Canada. You know, I'll come back to this in a second, but in Canada, Mr. Trudeau signs with a smile that we're now part of the global agreement. On the one hand, says we're going to actually bring in place a carbon plan, a climate plan in Canada to meet our Paris targets. It's actually Harper's plan, but that's an aside. I'll come to that in a second. He brings in, done nothing, argues we need to build pipelines to have a climate plan. Makes no sense, because what Paris says, not only to Canada or British Columbia, but to the world, is effective immediately. We must turn the corner and stop investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure that will continue to be around for decades to come. As I say again, we don't build a coal-fired plant today to tear it down tomorrow. It's about making the right choice and investments today that'll affect tomorrow. And I'll come back to some of the ramifications and the importance of this bill later. So coming back to federally in this context of meeting our legislation, federally, ironically, people like me are beginning to look quite fondly upon the time of Mr. Harper, because he did nothing on the climate change file, nothing at all. And Mr. Trudeau has done negative by stumping for pipelines. It's remarkable that we have this cognitive dissonance happening politically federally at a time when the rest of the world, most of the world is actually recognizing the seriousness of this. Norway, for example, a nation that recognized that climate change is not only something to be concerned about, it's also an opportunity. Did you know that 40% of new cars in Norway are electric? They're electric today. Netherlands, India, other jurisdictions have announced that all new cars will be electric by 2030. Here in British Columbia, we have an opportunity for leadership. And the first step in claiming that leadership is setting in place targets. Because it is those targets that allow the civil service, that allow the modelers to do their wedge analyses so that we can actually start to understand what the effects of certain policy measures are in terms of future greenhouse gas reductions. And that work is ongoing as I speak, and I'm very pleased that it is ongoing as we speak. So coming back to the LNG relationship with this legislation, I've heard it say that LNG Canada is talking about a 2-train LNG facility instead of a 4-train. Well, I've got the numbers for a 2-train LNG facility as well, and Honourable Speaker, they're no different. If LNG Canada invested 2-train LNG facility in Kitimat, all other aspects of our economy would have to drop their emissions from 63.3 megatons in 2015 to 34.5 in 2030, 21.4 in 2040, and 8.6 in 2050. That's a 46, 66, and 86% reduction. 86% reduction. Everything else other than LNG Canada. These are big numbers, Honourable Speaker. These are very big numbers. And very big numbers cannot be met without bold plans. And that is what we're looking forward to. We're looking forward to seeing that plan because, frankly, I got into politics back in 2012, not because I saw this wonderful opportunity for a career in politics. That was not the intention. Is that I was involved very intimately with Gordon Campbell's government and the development of the climate policy and climate strategies and his government, which, Honourable Speaker, I know you were part of at that time, in his government as they put British Columbia on the map as a leader internationally in both the challenges, dealing with the challenge and recognizing the opportunity of what greenhouse gas mitigation does. We were leaders. And then I saw that start to crack apart. I saw that start to crack about in 2012. And I could not stand by, Honourable Speaker, and say to my students who would come to, I would talk in these classes. I would talk in classes about framing the whole issue of climate change as an issue of intergenerational equity, because it is. Today's generation, our decision makers, won't have to live the consequences of our decisions. And those who do better participate in our democratic institutions because they're going to inherit those consequences. And they don't. And I would ask them, why don't you vote? Why is it that 30 to 40% of youth between 18 and 24 until the last election voted federally? And they would say to me that all politicians are corrupt, all they want to do is line their policy. And I'd say to them, no, that's not the case. People go there for a right reason. And if you don't like them, run yourself or find someone to run. But this is a system we have. And in 2012, I'm giving this same lecture, and I'm looking at myself in the face saying, I'm a hypocrite. I can tell them that if they don't like what's happening, they should run themselves. So I ran. I ran with the BC Green Party, and let me tell you, Honourable Speaker, it is not the easiest path to this legislature, as my friend from Saanich North and the Islands and my friend from Cowichan Valley will attest. Running with the BC Green Party, a party that had elected nobody before in any province, is not what you do if you're looking for a political career in power. You do that out of principle. The same goes for my colleague Adam and my colleague Sonia. And we're here. We're here with 17% of British Columbians saying we support you. And we were very clear in our campaign that this defining issue of our time is one that we're here to push to ensure that British Columbia capitalizes on the opportunities. We can be laggards of yesteryear, or we can be leaders of tomorrow. I think British Columbians want to be a leader. We could talk about revenue. Revenue to natural gas was billions of dollars, well, it's more than $1 billion a little over a decade ago. And now, well, a couple of years ago, we actually lost money. Now we're making in a few tens of millions of dollars. We are not, Honourable Speaker, I'm the designated speaker, I noticed the light has come on. We are not going to continue to bring wealth and prosperity to British Columbia if we continue to chase the economy of the past. We are blessed in British Columbia with resources, renewable resources, and raw resources like minerals, like gas, like water, like forest. We're blessed with resources that we have a duty and responsibility to steward for future generations. Not only the resources themselves, but also the environmental and social systems that surround them. And that's why this bill is critical as giving the first step of those targets that will allow the civil service, the wedge analyses, to get there. We know, for example, let's look at the mining sector. British Columbia is blessed with a mining sector. We are some of the world's leading miners around the world. Many of them started, some of them get bought up. Look at Teck, Cominco. Well, it's now just Teck. Teck, an incredible asset to British Columbia. Teck's a good company, a good steward of the environment. Teck would love to be able to use electric trucks, but there's no technology out there. There's an opportunity for BC innovation. There's an opportunity for BC to actually do what Norway is doing in replacing their ferries with electric ferries with batteries built in Richmond, no less. Why are we not recognizing this innovative opportunity for heavy industry? Electric trucks. We got lots of electricity. We got a company like Teck, a leader, a global leader ready to adopt. There's an opportunity. Here's another piece of innovation out there. We have we talk about gas filling stations all over the place. You want to be a leader in the new economy? You recognize that you can get land really cheap on the highway between here and there, halfway between towns. And you can start to put a gas station there, but the gas you're doing is actually electricity for electric vehicles. Because when you fill up in a high voltage electric 400 volt charger, it'll take you 30 minutes. You're going to sit there, you have a cup of coffee. It's an opportunity for innovation to start to create charging sessions. But that innovation needs government to get out of the way. Right now in British Columbia, you cannot give away your electricity and ask someone to pay for it unless you're a registered utility. I have an electric charging station at my house. I'd love to charge the member from West Vancouver Capilano 35 cents every time he filled his electric car up. But I can't. I have to
25.
And there we go. My colleague here would charge him 25, and the free market starts to come to play here. Capitalism, free market economy, here we go. He's charging 25, and maybe my colleague there from Port Alberni, actually Whiskey Creek, will say, I'm going to charge 20, because I got a First Nation, the Hawaiian, who've got a generating station there, and they have excess power. We want to charge that power here. Let's go. This is innovation, Honourable Speaker. Yet we in British Columbia used to be leaders in that regard, and now, sadly, we've fallen off that. This legislation is the very first step, the necessary first step, mirroring what was done in 2007 by Gore and Campbell to get us back on the right path. British Columbia has an electric car company here, Electromechanica. Our colleague ran in Vancouver Mount Pleasant there against the member from Vancouver Mount Pleasant. This is the company that builds electric vehicles. It's traded publicly on the NASDAQ, builds electric vehicles in Victoria. But now, guess what? The factories are going to be in China and India, and he's got hundreds of millions of dollars of sales coming forward. But in BC, we should be doing that here. We should be saying to Terrace, we get that you have some economic issues right now because the oil and gas sector is hurting because the price has gone through the floor. But you're on a rail line between Chicago and Prince Rupert. You're on that rail line, and guess what? We can get your goods manufactured there to market in both the biggest East Coast and the Asian markets. But what we need is to attract manufacturing there, and by recognizing that there's a whole generation of manufacturers who want to be clean and good corporate citizens. B Corps, the legislation I just brought in a couple of days ago, B Corps, benefit corporations. We could give them that clean energy. We don't have to double down on the economy yesterday. We could say that Terrace is the place to go, 100 Mile House. We could, all of these local, small communities across our province have their own strategic advantages that make them the place to go for innovation in a variety of areas. Forest fire innovation. There is so much potential there, both in terms of the type of suits that people wear, through the suppression techniques for innovation in the forest fire sector. We have innovation in the forestry industry, but we buy our innovation from Finland, where there was a government there that recognized that in order to compete, we can't compete by racing to the bottom. We can only compete if we are smarter, because otherwise we're going to give our resources away. We're smarter and we're more efficient. Therein lies an opportunity there. And in those opportunities, those wedge opportunities, we meet our targets at the same time as we bring economic prosperity to British Columbia, not only for this generation, but for generations to come, because not doing so is a problem. We bemoan, and it's a tragedy that we have the flooding events in Boundary Similkameen region this year. We had flooding last year. We had forest fires last year. We had forest fires that took out much of Fort McMurray. This is a story that happens year in, year out, not only in BC, but everywhere. But as I've tried to point out time and time again, the issue of global warming that this is addressing, the issue of global warming is fundamentally a question of intergenerational equity. Do we, the present generation, owe anything to future generations in terms of the quality of environment that we leave behind? If the answer is no, who cares about global warming? Really, it doesn't matter, because it just goes to hell in a handbasket, and I don't care about future generations. But if we care, yes, we must act now, because waiting is too late. The analogy that's direct, Honourable Speaker, is you put a pot of water on the stove and you turn it up to 8. Now that dial there is essentially greenhouse gas emissions at the level of the atmosphere of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. You turn it up. The water's cool, it starts to warm. I don't worry about global warming, I don't care. The thing's on 8, it starts to get a bit warm, you go, oh, this is getting hot. It starts to get a little bit warm, I'm gonna turn 8 down to 7. It gets warmer, now it starts boiling, oh, I better turn it off. And you turn it down to 0, but guess what? It's too late. And the analogy is direct to the world. 71% of our globe is covered by water. It takes time for the oceans to heat up. And once they do, you can't cool them right away either. The analogy is direct, and once you get to a stage where you say, oh, it's too warm, we better cool it, it's too late, frankly, Honorable Speaker. Now we worry about a forest fire here and a flood there, and I get that, it's really important. But it pales in comparison to the plight that's in store for us. And you can go back and look at what the climate science has been saying for decades. It's been the same thing. Those touting that it's just somehow some natural cycles, they act like a legal defense team who's lost their case. They throw all sorts of public doubt out there, fake news and all, hoping that the public jury will render a not guilty verdict. But we know that a substantial fraction, something like 60% of the world's species will be committed to extinction, 60 to 80%, at the end of this century, as a direct consequence of greenhouse gas emissions. We can't turn the level of atmospheric dioxide up on the scale of 100 years to the levels that haven't been seen since Jurassic and Triassic and not think there's not going to be an ecological response. We are literally going back to the Triassic and Jurassic in the scale of a few decades as we take that captured carbon that was captured in those swamps and seas and created coal and natural gas that we're releasing in decades. Sure, life will go on after an extinction event, and it'll come on in a different form, but it certainly will not be life like we know it today. We know that when in the big extinction events in Earth's history, when a meteor hit or when we had more intensive volcanic activity, there were 80%, 90% marine organisms went extinct. We know we're on track to do that now. We know that the biggest sink of atmospheric carbon is the oceans. We know that the Great Barrier Reef is probably gone, and there's nothing we can do about it because of the sink of the carbon that exists. We know that many of the ocean's corals are dead, and they will die forever, and there's not much we can do about it. These are just the early stages. And again, I come to the point of, do we as a present generation actually owe anything to future generations? Because if we do, we must act here now. We must not weigh, for example, one LNG plant against jobs that may or may not exist 5 years from now versus the opportunity for success in a new economy that preserves prosperity and the environment that our next generation will actually come to live in. These are not options. I talk about some of the sad things I see when one day I see a politician putting sandbags up on a dike, and the next day that same politician's here arguing rah, Kinder Morgan LNG. Where's the disconnect? The disconnect is mind-boggling. I mean, again, we go back to this issue that we're proposing to deal with here. The greenhouse effect goes back to Jean-Baptiste Joseph Fourier in the early 1800s, the first to recognize the atmosphere acts like a greenhouse that allows incoming solar radiation through but blocks outgoing long-wave radiation to act like a blanket to keep the surface warm. We've known about the different effects of a variety of greenhouse gases since the 1860s. We've known about the specific role of carbon dioxide in the 1890s. We had the first multi-century projections in the 1930s. In 1979, when I was graduating from high school, Jules Charney, an MIT climate and atmospheric scientist, was tasked with the first national assessment in the US, and they came up with the best estimate of the single most important metric, summarizing our cumulative understanding of the world's response to increasing greenhouse gases. That is climate sensitivity. Climate sensitivity, by definition, is how much will the world warm if we double atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from pre-industrial levels, from 280 to 560 parts per million. In 1979, the very best estimate was between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees. That was the range. In 1990, the first IPC assessment, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, scores of publications examined. Best estimate, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. 1997, I think, or 1996, second assessment report. Best estimate, 1.5 to 4.5 degrees. The best estimate, the single best estimate of the single most important metrics, summarizing our cumulative understanding of how the world responds to a doubling of carbon dioxide. Has not changed from 1979 to 1996, where we're in the second assessment report. We moved to 2001. We're now at the third assessment report. The best assessment gives 1.5 to 4.5 degrees, and then we moved to 2007. That's the Nobel Prize year. It moves to 2 to 4.5 degrees. Whoop, la, we've changed it slightly. And then in 2013, I was involved in every report from 1996 through 2013. And that 2013 one was fundamentally frustrating. 2013, the report had largely computed in 2012. I withdrew from the process when the writ was dropped in the 2013 election, but all the rating had been done. The 2013 estimate from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, summarizing thousands, tens of thousands of papers' knowledge on this issue. The best estimate of climate sensitivity, the single most important metric, summarizing our cumulative understanding of what will happen as a consequence of global warming. That is, how much will the world warm if we double carbon dioxide? The best estimate was 1.5 to 4.5 degrees, Honourable Speaker. We don't need more science. What we need is political will. And what we don't need is more grandstanding on these important issues, which is why I'm excited about this bill. Why I'm excited about this bill, because it provides the first step, as was done in 2007, the very first step that is necessary to actually give us towards, head us in a direction. And that necessary step, this should be taken as a signal. If government is serious about this bill brought forth, it cannot support the addition of 2 or 4 train LNG facility. We just can't do it because you can't square that round peg. You cannot square that round peg. It doesn't work, the numbers don't work, and the last thing this government needs to do is try to play the accounting games that happened towards the end of the last administration's governance. We start to get things like, okay, I'm going to give you money and take a carbon credit because you're not going to cut down those trees that otherwise you would cut down. This is the kind of carbon accounting nonsense we get into, because you have to be, if you open that Pandora's box, you're going to have to start accounting for forest fire losses as well, and we don't want to do that, let me tell you. We start to pay in Canada, they had at the time, we gave them carbon offset as they actually upgraded some natural gas facilities. Okay, that's fine, but that was not the intent. The intent was not to, the intent was actually to get fundamental changes and send a direction to the economy we want to move elsewhere. And we have to be careful how we continue with these offsetting. With that, Honourable Speaker, I will suggest that this debate, I have both my colleagues from Saanich North and the Islands and my colleague from Cowichan Valley will be looking to speak to this bill further. I do want to touch upon the last 2 things that I haven't marked. I want to support the Minister in his ability to be given the powers to set sectoral targets through regulation. I think that's important, and he's articulated and identified in his opening remarks that he will seek guidance from that, from his climate, I forget the name of this reincarnation, we'll call it Climate Leadership Team 3.0 for purpose of Hansard. He will seek advice from them. They represent sectoral variety of sectors, and I think that's a good strategy, and I think the approach is a fine one. I also want to give the Minister a lot of credit for adopting the recommendation of the Attorney General, the Auditor General, Canadian Auditor General, with respect to biannual reporting out of the risks, as well as how we are moving towards meeting those risks of climate change, because the risks are very real and very serious and will get worse as time goes on. You know, I could talk about, for example, we knew since 2000 when a student of mine, Dahi Stone, now went to Oxford after that. I lost touch with him the last few years. Was a lecturer there after that. He wrote a paper where he analyzed precipitation trends in Canada. We know extreme precip is going up. We know, for example, we can attribute, we did this in 2004, Nathan Gillett, now he's a former postdoc. He's now head of the Environment Canada Canadian Centre for Climate Modelling and Analysis. We know in 2004 that we could detect and attribute the increasing area burnt of forest fires in Canada directly to human activity. We know that. We know what the cause is. We know that what the precursors are. We need to have ignition. Well, we got lots of lightning. We need to have dry timber, and the way you get dry timber is through soil moisture and summer warmth. We know we can detect regional changes in temperature, increasing temperatures. And again, I can say I've said the same thing since the 1990s. As a climate science community, we know what's going to happen. We know that we're going to get increasingly extreme weather events, particularly in precipitation. The 100-year event is no longer a 100-year event. It'll become a 25, a 10-year event, and then it'll become a 5-year event and so forth. We know we're going to get that. We know we're going to increase our precipitation at our latitudes. We know water here is not going to be an availability issue. It's going to be a storage issue because we know we're going to get increased water in the winter and less in the summer because we have increased likelihood of summer droughts. We know that in the winter it's going to be increasingly likely in more and more extreme events. And ironically, Honourable Speaker, we might get amazing snow years because if the temperature is slightly below zero, it's snow instead of rain. And so, yes, we might get a big snowfall, but that's exactly what we would expect to get because it's winter and it's cold. And we expect increasing amounts of the warming climate to have more moisture in it. We expect a northward shift of the storm track. So, yes, and lo and behold, we're getting more of these higher, stronger storms hitting our latitude. But what would you think? That's exactly what we've been saying. These move further northward. Same in the south. We know where Arctic sea ice is going. We know it's likely going to be gone in the summer in a few decades. We know that 2017 is right on the edge of setting a new record, the record that was first set in 2007 and then broken quite dramatically in 2010. We're on path to beat it again this year. We know that global sea ice volume was a record low this year. We know that if we don't do anything, we're going to commit 60 to 80% of the world's species to extinction towards the end of this century. We know that we're going to get increasing droughts. We know that we're going to flood islands. We know that there are tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people living on the coast. And we know if we get warming to about 2 degrees, we have a very high probability that we're committed to 7 meters of sea level rise because that puts Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheet past the point of no return. Now, we also know that when there's a storm, and we know that there's increasingly strong storms, that we actually get storm surges. And we know with the warming water, again, you could do this experiment at home, you have a high tide, warming water and storms, you get big storm surges and you start to see things like Hurricane Sandy flooding New York. But now what happens when New York, which is flooded once, starts to get flooded like that every 10 years? And then you add 6 meters of sea level rise on that. You start to create a problem for our built infrastructure. A problem that when you have hundreds of millions of people living within 10 meters of the coast, the town of Shanghai, the burgeoning metropolis of Shanghai is less than 10 meters from the coast. You get rid of the Greenland and West Antarctic ice sheets, pretty hard for them to adapt if you add 10 meters of sea level rise. Pretty hard for Delta's Richmond to adapt if they have 10 meters of sea level rise. It's not going to happen overnight. This is why the issue is one of intergenerational equity. That won't even happen in the next 100 years. It takes hundreds of years for that to happen. But Honourable Speaker, let members in this House know that history will not be kind. History will not be kind to those of us who stand by and let this happen. We'll be judged. We will be judged. So be it if people don't care, if they don't care about intergenerational equity. That's fine. People don't have children, they might not care. Some people might have belief systems that this conflicts with. They might believe, for example, that whatever's going to happen was meant to happen. And it's God's will, and we, as climate scientists, we can't argue science against faith. You can't dismiss those views. Those views, well, they are there people within our society because no science can ever address the question, do we as a society need to actually deal with this issue? That requires all of us. But what we need to do, Honourable Speaker, is we need to get facts and evidence on the table, and we've got to stop listening to rhetoric that's put forward and doublespeak like we need to build pipelines in order to have a climate plan. Politicians need to be truthful to the people of British Columbia. They need to know what the consequences of inaction are. And if society believes you don't need to deal with this problem, so be it. I happen to think we do, and I happen to think most people do believe we need to deal with this issue. And as such, this bill is critical. And when we apply this, it's critical not only to implement this bill, but also the subsequent policy measures that will ensure we'll meet these targets. Because targets have been in place in Canada since the 1980s, where Brian Mulroney introduced the first targets. And we've got a litany of missed and failed targets. Europe met their targets. We have not met our targets here in Canada, not one, not close, not even a little bit close to any of our targets. And so I look forward to the subsequent legislation announcements to come. And with that, Honourable Speaker, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to further debate.